Love it or hate it, you can't deny that the JWT has become an integral part of the modern web, especially for web services and distributed microservices. Now, the JWT or the JSON Web Token is something that you will see as a very common aspect of authentication and authorization in modern web services. Now, some of you may know some things about the JWT, but you may not know why it's actually needed. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about why the JWT is actually needed and what purpose does it serve when we were transitioning from the previous state of what the web was to what the web is currently and what it's likely to be moving forward. Let's get started with this video. We're going to be constantly putting out content on AppSec, cloud security, container security, DevSecOps, and Kubernetes security. Now, if you like this sort of content, you should consider liking and subscribing to this channel on YouTube. In addition, it would be great if you could follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Now, this video is an introductory video which is part of our new course that we released on AppSec Engineer called JWT Jiu-Jitsu. Now, JWT Jiu-Jitsu is a really hands-on technical attack and defense course focused on JWT, breaking JWT, and how you can secure JWT. So you should definitely be looking at this course, and don't forget that with AppSec Engineer or with a subscription to AppSec Engineer, you get access to courses on DevSecOps, cloud security, container security, Kubernetes security, application security, advanced application security, threat modeling, and much more. We're always coming up with new content, and it's an amazing value for either an annual subscription or a monthly subscription. So do check out AppSec Engineer and get yourself some JWT knowledge as well as knowledge on several other areas and a constantly expanding library. Let's get started with our video on JWT and an introduction to JWT. Let's start off with our first segment, which is going to be introducing JWT or JSON Web Token. Now, the JSON Web Token is a very important authentication and authorization technology that's come about, and that was not quite there in the past. In fact, in the past, they used to do something very differently. Let's look at why it even happened and why we need JSON Web Tokens and why we have seen this emerge as the de facto standard in authentication and authorization today. So, in the past, we typically used to work with sessions. So, you typically used to have a user. Now, this user used to obviously want to communicate with some kind of a web application. Now, most of the time, this web application was a standard, a basic web application that you could access via the browser. So you go out to the browser and you could sign into the web application and you could access that web application. Now the user would essentially log in to that web application, so authenticate to the application. Now once the user authenticated to the web application, it would generate a new object on the back end of that web application called a session for that particular user, and it would issue the user with a session token or a session ID. So the user would get a session token with a bunch of attributes, and that user would submit that session in every subsequent request so that the user could identify themselves as an authenticated user of that application. So the session token would be automatically sent back by your browser so that it would be considered an authenticated transaction. So every time the user would send the session token, the token would be verified against the session store and the user's authenticated status would be reviewed. And if the user is authenticated, then it would allow that user to do X, Y, or Z on that particular system. But this started becoming a pretty huge problem in the world of microservices. Now, in the world of microservices, you have a lot of challenges because you have multiple services, and a lot of times services are coming up, services are getting discovered dynamically. You have API gateways, you have a lot of essentially decentralized applications that you're deploying all over the place. Now, the user essentially, when they have to work with these kind of applications, they cannot rely on a single point of failure like a session store. So previously it was one application, then one application had a session store, and that session store could be relied on because that application along with that session store would be scaled. So if you have to add multiple instances of that application, you have to ensure that the session store can also support that kind of scalability. But with microservices, you have a lot of dynamic components, you have a lot of dynamic applications. Applications are being added all the time, removed all the time from this particular set of stacks. So you will see that there is a certain level of decentralization that's going into these applications. And you might see that one service may be able to talk to another
another service, but one service may not be able to talk to another service. So it's again a very decentralized mesh-like setting that you typically have when it comes to a microservice or REST API or web services style of applications that are very popular today. So you don't essentially want to have single points of failure. You don't want to have this session store that is this one central session store that each service has to talk to, and that is now becomes your single point of failure because you have to scale that one thing and it becomes a little complicated to do that. So, which is why you essentially had decentralized authentication and authorization technology available to you in the form of a JSON web token. So that's really what led to the need or the creation of some kind of JSON decentralized system of authentication and authorization called the JSON Web Token. So basically with JWT, what you really have is that you have a system that does not rely on this central session store. So JWT uses some kind of cryptographic operations to be able to validate whether that user is authenticated or not based on the cryptography, not based on the data existing or not existing in a single session store. So typically you can use a set of cryptographic operations to be able to verify if that token or if that particular user's authentication value is actually authentic or not. And that's how you can allow that user to perform certain tasks. You can also use JWTs for machine-to-machine communication, service-to-service communication. Remember, it's not always users who are accessing your application or your microservices stack. It's also other applications. So they need to be able to present some kind of authenticity value as well. So in this case, with JWT, you'll typically have a user, you'll have a service. You'll also, in most cases, have an identity provider. Now, this identity provider, the user authenticates, or that service authenticates through the identity provider, gets a signed token. And this is where the cryptography comes in. So the signed token is meant to be something that cannot be forged. The integrity of it is kept or is meant to be highly secure so that when the service comes in, it can validate the signature of that particular token. The cryptographic part of it is where I'm talking about, and then validate whether that is a genuine token or not, hence allowing that user or that device or that service to be able to authenticate to this service and perform whatever it needs to perform. So that's basically what a JWT facilitates. It takes away that whole single point of failure that used to happen with these session stores and comes up with a different model, which is using these cryptographic operations to validate and provide the same level or equivalent assurance as it used to happen in the world of session objects. And that's really what a JWT is all about. So it supports decentralized authentication, decentralized authorization. And that's really what the JWT has revolutionized in terms of its treatment towards the modern application stack.
If you like that video, you should consider liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. And if you want the best quality education for AppSec, cloud native security, Kubernetes, DevSecOps, threat modeling, and a constantly updated library of amazing courses with amazing hands-on labs, you should get a subscription for AppSecEngineer.com. Subscriptions are available for both individuals and teams of any size that you can access on AppSecEngineer.com. Please check us out.